that has been a consistent trend where people want things quick and they want things cheap. So those are the parameters in which consumers think, and I don't think that's necessarily going to change. If I was in a secret room where no one could hear what I said about what I think about myself, I fundamentally think I'm a storyteller. This could be controversial. I quite like the Mughal era clothing, like the kind of ornamental, the wide shalwar kameez, the sherwanis. I think that's still popular probably in Pakistan and India, but
So, Ahmed, welcome to the Subject Matter Show. I've heard you speak on topics before, such as supply chain, inventory, but also building and scaling Hyran technologies. I'm very excited to pick your brain today. We were talking about a lot of things earlier, so I want to just take a step back. And when I was doing research for this podcast, I saw that your career has hit a lot of amazing highlights. You've worn many hats before. You've been a guest lecturer. You're a content creator. You've been an analyst. And of course, you've been an entrepreneur before, and now as well, like you're a co-founder of Hyran Technologies. So just wanted to understand, like from a personal perspective, like how do you really identify yourself as a professional, and like what has been your journey like to build and launch Hyran Technologies today?
yeah, that's a good question. I think you stumped me with the first question because I don't know how I typically identify. It changes from room to room. I think not to bring in, my background too much into my psychology of behavior, but you growing up in one country, living in another country, you're used to being a chameleon and you're used to sort of blending with the surroundings. So how I define myself professionally, it's the same way. I blend myself in whatever room I'm in. If I'm in an academic setting, then I lean on my PhD. If I'm in a, company setting where I'm talking to a fashion brand, then I might lean in on my technical expertise in the fashion supply chain. So I find that, this is the thing that I think is always interesting. It goes back to what you were talking about earlier about this idea of like Anglo way of working, which is like, you choose a career and then you kind of stick with that career and then you're well defined within a particular path. But I think what is like a career today is very different to maybe what a career was, 50 years ago, where, wearing many hats. And what hopefully I think, and I don't want to sound too sort of idealistic here, but what hopefully keeps us together is a sense of purpose. And then I guess fundamentally, if I was to ask myself internally, if I was in a secret room where no one could hear what I said about what I think about myself, I fundamentally think I'm a storyteller. I think that I like telling stories about different concepts and different things. And I think that's probably the only through line that goes through all of the works that I do. Whether it's teaching, I love telling stories when I teach. Whether it's an academic setting, I'm telling a story about my product, about how I got to this product, or whether it's, working in content creation, that's very much, embedded in storytelling. So maybe that's how I secretly define myself, but I don't know how I feel about calling myself a storyteller in a professional setting.
I can relate to some of it because I've gone through a little bit of like that chameleon trajectory myself. I was very impressed to see that you've hit so many interesting like highs in your career in a very short span of time. So that was very, very impressive. I want to take a step into the world of the fashion. But before that, I want to take our listeners to fashion and consumption over the decades. So whenever I have guests on the show from different parts of the world, I love talking about how fashion and consumption has changed in their countries or their regions. And it's interesting because it's a window, time capsule into that specific world, but also it compares the socioeconomic and cultural shifts in that part of the world. And so I want to talk about and how you feel like these shifts in fashion consumption and production have changed. And I know you have a history with the country, so you can also like tell me about like your experiences growing up there and what it looks like today in terms of fashion consumption.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Saudi Arabia mostly, but I spent a lot of time in Pakistan, so I can kind of talk about both. But I think one thing for sure is that in my lifetime, I've seen that because of a wide variety of changes in terms of technology, in terms of social media, access has become a lot easier. I remember when I was a kid, we couldn't access a lot of different types of brands that maybe we had heard of in the countries that we lived in. They just didn't sell them there. They made them there, ironically, but they didn't sell them there. So we would have, to go on holiday in the US or to the UK or whatever, we'd always be like, oh yeah, I really want to get a Gap shirt, or like a Gap hoodie because we saw it on a TV show. And because of access was so limited, consumption was also as a result kind of stifled, right? Because, you weren't able to access things as easily. Obviously, online sale wasn't really a thing. E-commerce wasn't really a thing. So if you went somewhere, you had to go physically and go and buy it. And naturally, friction, there was friction between the consumer and the products that you wanted to buy, right? And I think over the years, the one thing that's been true, and I think Jeff Bezos says this, he's like, there's one thing that we'll know that's going to be true today and true 50 years from now, which is people are going to want things quick and they're going to want things cheap. And I think there's a sense to that which has continued all the way back. If you map it back to the Victorian eras when they first started mass producing, that has been a consistent trend where people want things quick and they want things cheap. So those are the parameters in which consumers think, and I don't think that's necessarily going to change. And that's the parameters which I think has probably followed your life and my life as well. Things have gone cheaper and your access to those things have gone quicker. And therefore, consumption in the form of clothing or fashion has always been an impulsive decision. You've never, very rarely needed something. You've always, need probably represents maybe 20% of the decision. Mostly it's want, it's 80%. It's the idea of an impulsive buy. Like sidebar, the reason why brands care so much about stockouts is because they understand that purchasing practices or behaviors are in fact impulsive and they're based on an immediate emotion that you're feeling in the moment. If you spend too long thinking about buying something, you probably don't get it. So you want to create a decision of like urgency, just like Black Friday. Oh, you got 2 hours left to buy whatever you need to buy.
Yeah.
And sometimes as a result, you buy things you don't need, because you're like, oh, wait, I only have 2 hours. I got to make an impulsive decision very, very quickly. It's genius in a way from a consumption perspective to get people to buy more by creating a sense of a deadline. So that is inherently appealing to the human psychology of impulse. And over the years, I think nothing I'm saying is unique to just Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. I think it's global because the sense of availability and the friction to enact on your impulses is so much lower, your consumption is increased. And that's just from a purchasing practices perspective, right? Like consumption rate. But then there's also what you're consuming. The other thing I noticed over the years is that what people consume has become, in a way, a lot more fractured, meaning there's a lot of subcultures. In Saudi Arabia, where I grew up mostly, men used to wear white thobes and women used to wear black abayas. That was it, right? And they would wear stuff in private, of course, right? I don't know what they wore in private, but like that's kind of the general trends. When we were in school, people tended to wear the same sort of clothes. Like, I don't know, people who grew up in the Middle East will, or maybe even in Dubai India will know this, but like there was an era where like those big Ralph Lauren logos on their t-shirts were in, I don't know. I was never into that, but that was definitely, it was like a weird thing. Like one person wore it and then suddenly everyone was wearing it, So there was a sense of some level of homogeny in the things that people were buying. But I think, again, with technology, with being able to find people that align with your viewpoints, align with your politics, align with your, perspective on life through social media, we've seen a rise of subcultures and an empowerment of those subcultures. And suddenly, with those subcultures goes music and clothing and everything else associated with that. And as a result, you see much more heterogeneous buying patterns in, even places like Saudi Arabia. Like you'll see like a skater group wearing skater clothes. You'll see, the traditional Saudi men wearing their thobes that are like perfectly ironed. All those things exist. And I think Pakistan is no different. The interesting thing about Pakistan is like there's like a spectrum, right? So there you have like the people who are hardworking in villages and farms wearing shalwar kameez. And then as their class sort of changes and they become into like, let's say, white collar jobs or middle class, they start wearing Western clothes. But then as they kind of get to this like elite group where like, they're all bureaucrats or they're like landowners, they start wearing shalwar kameez again. So I don't know, it's like some sort of like,
That's quite interesting, yeah.
weird trajectory where I think a lot of that I don't know if this is the case. I'm maybe bringing in my own analysis into this, which hasn't been validated, but a lot of that I feel is a sense of when someone reaches a certain part of society, they almost feel a sense of decolonizing their background. So they're like, well, I'm now this big landlord or bureaucrat. Why should I wear the clothes of my colonizer? And as a result, maybe that's the psychology behind why there's this taking an ownership of your clothing. So, yeah.
However, I do feel like in some ways, like fashion has become homogenous as well, because I feel if you look at fast fashion brands, which are, the highest market cap, like today in the consumers industry, like globally, they're pretty much producing similar things. Like I feel if you spend some time on TikTok and Instagram, you'll realize a lot of the products like look so much similar. So it's kind of like this weird dichotomy. I want to put in a little bit more context on this conversation around fashion and supply chain. So we have like three broad trends that I want to highlight from McKinsey's State of Fashion 2025 report. First and foremost, like you mentioned, consumers are prioritizing value. And I think that's never changed, but more and more so, like we're going through an economic crisis in most parts of the world. And brands really have to demonstrate why their products are worth that kind of premium price. Transparency in pricing is critical to consumers today. We're also seeing that the inventory equation, getting that right is also a core focus, which is we've seen inventory is directly linked to profitability. And I also feel regulations have a big part to play in how we're going to consume in the future, and specifically in some parts of the world. Why is it so hard to get this equation of inventory right?
Yeah.
And then we'll talk a little bit more about like forecasting as probably the next step.
Yeah. I think the inventory equation starts a lot earlier. Like the problem with inventory equation starts around in the 1840s, because that's when mass production really started. And people often associate mass production with the rise of like sewing machines and mechanization in factories, but actually mass production started because they started standardizing sizes. And it was, without standardized sizing, you have no way to hold stock because you don't know what kind of sizes to hold. And prior to that, it was all tailor-made. So what happened is that even before sewing machines really started kicking off and speeding up efficiency of making clothes, size standardization meant that retailers and brands went from, getting orders, on a regular basis from a specific person, like tailor-made orders, to having to hold stock, to taking a risk on their balance sheet and holding inventory. Now, naturally, they got it wrong sometimes, a lot of the times. And that meant that suddenly they had to find ways to recuperate some of that loss. So that led to a couple of changes. One, it led to the sort of, use of discounting and markdowns as a tool set, as a mechanism to get rid of inventory. And secondly, it resulted in this obsession with getting costs down. Now, getting costs down meant that, you had to reduce workers' wages, you had to cut corners, etc. And with machinery, that, meant that you could work faster. And, if in factories, everything is costed to the minute. So the way that a garment, very few garment factories charge per unit, they charge per minute, because different garments take longer to make, shorter to make. And then because people are getting paid by hour, it makes sense for them to charge per minute. So the idea was, how can we reduce the minute time? You have two levers. You either reduce the minutes that it takes to make the product, which means you simplify the product itself, or you reduce the workers' wages, which means you pay them less per hour. So just keep that in mind. So this is like the new model of making money in the fashion industry, starting from the standardization of sizing. And that led to enormous growth. Like loads of brands started to take advantage of this. It resulted in a lot of riots. So there was, in the east of London, there were a lot of riots, workers' riots. In the north of the UK, there were a lot of workers' riots because they felt they were not being paid a fair wage and they were being squeezed for cost. The whole reason why they were being squeezed for cost was because of this business model, the idea of holding inventory and not knowing if it's going to sell. And, you want to minimize your costs or your potential loss. So you force the product to go down in price. Now, over the years, as, mass production and, machinery was created, this model sustained itself and created a lot of money for people. And then, you had World War II. And after World War II, the whole world nearly ripped itself apart. So there was a new world order with the United Nations and this idea that, we need to work together with other countries and trade with other countries to ensure common peace. And this trade with other countries post-World War II led to something called globalization. And what globalization meant was that suddenly, you could take advantage of the labor structures and costs in other countries at little to no cost in terms of tariffs and bring them into your own country and start selling them. And guess what? Like your cost that was, you were incurring in the US or in the UK, well, you could get that down even further, which is great because the business model you have is all on gambling on what inventory you want to sell. So suddenly, Nike came around and said, let's buy shoes from Japan, import them into the US, and then continue to do that. But then what happened is over the years, Japan started to industrialize and, wages went up. And suddenly that way of working didn't really work with Japan. So Nike is like, well, let's move away from Japan. Let's go to Korea. Same thing happened there. They developed facilities, they worked with them, people started to earn money, great for the business for both parties, but then suddenly the country rises in terms of, standards of living, and then now it's too expensive. So you got to move to another country. And then you have this country hopping situation that you see today in the fashion industry. So now you get to a point where, we started in the Victorian era in 1840s, but now we're in the modern era. So what stayed constant is this business model, like buying inventory in advance, holding it, hoping that you'd be able to sell it. And then if it doesn't sell, well, you bought it so cheaply, it's all right, or you can discount it and get it out. But a couple of things changed over those years. So firstly, one thing that changed was that in the Victorian era, trends changed about every 7 years. Now trends are changing every 7 days. So the inventory that you're holding is far more risky than it was back then. So the risk equation changed. The second thing that changed is that, costs have gone up across the world of labor costs. And where they haven't gone up, there's a lot of international pressure through the ILO, through the UN to make sure that those costs are going up. And on top of that, there are tariffs. So now, this is a bit of a projection of what's going to happen going forward. This is not what's happening now, but that globalization that we saw from World War II to now, we're kind of seeing a reverse of it. We're seeing isolationism, tariffs, people wanting to in-house production. And that's going to lead to the end of this way of working where you could buy overseas, import it into local markets and be able to sell it. You're going to need to find a solution. So that's kind of the history of why the inventory model, why it started, why it actually created a lot of money and growth and prosperity for a lot of brands, and then why it's no longer going to work because trends are changing too fast. It's getting harder and harder to import. Supply chains have become far more complex. And, the ability to find a way to produce at lowest cost is actually costing you a lot of money. So the flip side to that coin is that what's happening now of this way of working is that as a result of buying in advance, holding, having long lead times, trying to chase that cheapest cost. By the way, that cheapest cost is only with regard to the cost of goods, not necessarily net profit or net revenue. Because what's happening is that you're getting goods at low cost, but nobody wants them, or you have too many of them, and you have not enough for the right amount, and then you owe money to the banks, you owe money to your suppliers. There's interest aggregating, there's warehousing costs, there's marketing costs, CPCs have gone up. So suddenly that business model is turning out to be quite inefficient for your bottom line. And not only that, you're getting a lot of heat for the fact that you are producing in countries which don't pay the workers the living wage, or you are trying to cut corners. And, this is not unique to just fast fashion brands. This LVMH is also guilty of this recently with their whole issues with not paying workers. And that's the reason why I think the inventory model, whilst the way of working, whilst it worked for a period of time, it's an extinct model for this period of time.
I just want to talk a little bit more about when you do forecasting now, like there's a traditional forecasting method, which has been, I'm guessing on an Excel sheet with some numbers and you kind of project it into the future. And then you have Hyran technologies coming in with, of course, like machine learned demand forecasting. So what is the core difference for somebody who does not really understand, the core idea of forecasting as is? What is the difference between the two?
Yeah. So one thing just to clarify is actually we don't do any demand forecasting for a particular reason. Well, that's not entirely true. I think it's relevant to what I just mentioned about the history of how supply chains work. Let's start with traditional forecasting. So what is traditional forecasting? Traditional forecasting is where you're trying to predict a year, 18 months out, what people are going to buy based on maybe previous year's sales, right? And adding like, oh, well, maybe we want to sell more this year, so we're going to add a little bit to the forecast. And that is in no way informed by any, external factors. Now, what is machine learning based forecasting? Well, the idea of machine learning based forecasting, which is not something we do, but I'll tell you anyway, is that you can capture externalities. So whereas you're making a decision based on previous year sales, the idea is like, well, what if we can capture information from weather? What if we can capture information from, micro trends that are happening in the industry? And the dimensionality of decision making increases. So the number of dimensions that you're considering to make a single decision explodes.
Right.
Now, a human mind can only handle about 4 dimensions to make a single decision. Machines can handle billions of dimensions to make an optimal decision. So that's why machine learning based forecasting is better than traditional forecasting. Now, I still think that even that kind of approach is limited in its benefits, because even if you can forecast it, it doesn't make a difference if you can't make it. What I mean by that is today's forecasts don't account for the physical constraints of the factory, the availability of material, the availability of capacity, tariffs that you might incur from making in different places. So really, the idea of trying to predict what people are going to buy in 18 months, even with an AI model, is, not such a great idea. Let me give you an example of how ridiculous that is. Now, I'm not trying to shun any forecasting companies or anything like that. I think What they're doing is demonstrably better than what brands were previously doing. But I still think it's the wrong let's say treatment for the diagnosis. Like that's what I'm trying to say. Like that's the wrong medicine. You don't need that. That's not the medicine you're looking for. You're looking for a different medicine. So let me explain. Google DeepMind released their state-of-the-art weather forecasting model that's better than any weather forecasting model in history, and it's 10 times better. And you know how many days in advance they can predict? 15 days. 15 days, right? Now you're telling me that a forecasting model a fashion company is using is somehow able to predict consumer behavior, which is a lot less scientific, by the way,
Right.
than weather.
Yep.
18 months in advance? That's a joke. Nothing that's predicted 18 months in advance should be relied upon as a decision that you're putting money behind. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that in order to make the fashion industry overproduce less, it has to work in a way that is far more agile and designed within the constraints of the fashion industry. And what that looks like is a longer conversation. We can get into that if you want. But fundamentally, what I'm trying to say is don't accept that you don't know. The first thing is accept that you don't know what consumers are going to do 18 months from now. Accept that you don't know how consumers are going to behave 3 months from now. All you're trying to do is set up a system that is robust enough from a supply chain perspective to change to the needs of your consumer. Meaning, if you're month by month, if you see what people want to buy slightly changes, then you can adjust your supply chain accordingly. I can get into more details of why. So one question might be, one person might logically say, aren't you just encouraging fast fashion by making the supply chain much more faster and much more agile? Why are you doing that? We're proponents of slow fashion. All right. So one thing that's important to understand is the physics of the manufacturer. The manufacturer sells minutes. They have capacity that they need to fill. They need to, pay workers. They need to buy material. They have loans from the bank. And unlike AWS, which can expand and collapse based on your needs on the net, a factory facility cannot do the same thing. It has a certain number of workers. Let's say they have like 10,000 or 5,000 workers. They're running the lines. Today, they need some level of consistency. They need some level of security. Now, the model that I'm proposing that allows you to be able to even adjust your forecast month to month is a model that relies on saying to the factory, hey, I know I'm going to do 1 million units with you this year. I don't know how those million units are going to be distributed, but let's say 1.2 million. So you put 100,000 units a month from me. So your workers have a job. For 100,000 units a month, you could figure out what number of workers that is. But those people are guaranteed. We're going to fill those lines, but I'll tell you month by month how I want you to fill those lines. And I mean, it's far more complicated than that, but I'm simplifying it. So, and then every month you basically are acting for the following month or following 2 months, and you're not forecasting per se. You are still forecasting. You're still trying to figure out what you need to buy, but you're not doing it in the way that the industries do it today, which is, let's figure out what people want to buy 18 months from now. Let's hold all that inventory. Let's hope that it sells. That is not the right way to work.
But to that, I want to ask, does that mean that the supply chain itself has to be not just agile in terms of, like you said, production, which is you tell your supplier that you're going to make X number of units and, for a certain amount of time, and then you update them over a period of time as to what they need to make. But that also means that they need to be agile to shipping those products and then being able to get consumer feedback. And if those products are not selling,
yes,
they're supposed to stop the production and then re-strategize. So is it really achievable? I feel like I know that it's much into the future, but I do not see that being super achievable with brands today.
So it's very achievable. And in fact, I'll explain exactly. We're actually doing this with one of our brands. And it's a big brand. So I'll give you an example. So if you decompose a product in fashion, it really comes down to, fabric and materials, and then capacity, like the time that it takes to put those materials together. What brands need to do, the reason why brands are forced to forecast 18 months out is because from when they issue a purchase order and if everything starts from scratch when they issue a purchase order, that means that the factory needs to start from zero, meaning, okay, we got to go buy the yarns. All right, then we got to convert those yarns into fabric, then fabric into dyed fabric, cut, and then sew, and then ship, put it together and send it out. Unless they're vertical, they rely on other parties to make those components, and they might just do cut and sew. That's what drags out the lead time. Maybe the fabric is nominated. Maybe the brand has, done some R&D with some sustainable materials with a particular fiber company, and you have to develop these fabrics. It has to come from that particular place. It takes months, So all of that combined, that is the reason why the lead time's so long. That's the reason why the brands have to forecast 18 months out. And that's the reason why those forecast models are ineffective. What we're arguing for is to say, all right, you don't know what you're going to make yet, but let's decide right now what materials you want to use, because that's 60% of your cost and 60% of your lead time. It's like saying to a chef, why don't you go ahead and buy the ingredients in advance and figure out what recipes you can make from those ingredients? That's the fundamental shift. So you say, all right, let's go and buy those materials. We'll buy, a bunch of that fabric, a bunch of this fabric. And then when we have a better idea, because one thing about forecast is that as they get closer to the season, they get more accurate because less things can happen between the point you forecast and when you need the goods, right? So basically, that's the idea. So if the longer you can wait to make a finished product decision, the better it is for everyone, for you, for your customers, for the environment, because you're not making stuff that nobody needs. So how can you get the process started without having to fix a particular style? So the way to get it started is to start buying the material. And so once you have the material, then you need to know, all right, factory, what's the last date that I have to tell you what the color needs to be before it's too late? Because I need these goods by 1st of March, because that's when my season starts, or that's when I'm planning to showcase my spring collection or whatever. What's the last date that you need to know from me that I need to dye this? Or what's the last date you need to know that I need to cut this? And that is just, let's say, 1st of March. But you don't need all your products for spring on the 1st of March. You maybe need some on the 15th of March, the 1st of April, the 15th of April. And that means that you have a staggered approach going through this. So there comes a point where maybe on the 1st of April, you get a signal for the 1st of March and the 15th of March drops that say, hey, this stuff was not doing so well. This stuff was doing well.
Right.
So when you're making a decision for the 1st of April, you have enough time for some decisions, not all decisions, some decisions to say, hey, actually, let's not dye that. Or, hey, actually, let's not, And having said that, the other thing is, it's not that I'm waiting for things to sell on the 1st of March and then making a decision for the batches that are coming on the 1st of April. By then, it's too late. What I'm relying on is the forecast accuracy improving as I get closer to the season. So maybe the forecast that comes for the 1st of April is actually, it's a month later than the 1st of March forecast, right? So it's going to be slightly better. In fact, I can tell you on average, once if you're like 9 months out, most brands have like about 30 to 35% accuracy on their forecast. As you get like 2 months out, your accuracy goes to 85% because less things can happen between when you're placing those orders and when you get them. So what that means is that you can take a newer forecast, which is hopefully more accurate, and use that to make those decisions. Yeah. So, that the staggered approach of, when do I need to commit to something, and you're doing multiple orders. Now, let me add a little bit of complexity. So you follow me so far, right? So
super clear.
Yeah. Okay. So multiple orders, you're committing to the materials, you're committing to the dye, cut, etc., and you're doing it in staggered approach because the delivery dates are staggered, right? So you can have a bit more time. The added complexity is here. Now, you can only place orders for minimums. So you have to make sure that you're abiding by the minimums.
Yeah.
There's going to be some material you pre-positioned that you didn't need, and you want your next forecast to capture that. So what I mean by that is that maybe in your first forecast, you thought you needed 10,000 units of this fabric. So you bought 10,000 units of worth of fabric. And then suddenly in your next forecast says 8,000. Okay, so you got to remember, you have 10,000 units already. You don't want to buy any more. So it's the interdependency of these decisions. It's the complexity that, you're not ordering 5 items. You're ordering thousands of different SKUs, which are going to different regions, have different size curves, have different colors. How do you manage that complexity? That's really where the role of AI comes in. The ability for you to drive and orchestrate this complex supply chains across multiple vendors with multiple styles, multiple decisions in a way that's easy for you as a human being to digest it and make a single decision. And that's really the role of AI. And that's what we do. So what I just explained there, that's what we do. We help brands make those decisions to be able to drive an agile supply chain and all the complex decisions around it, whether it's, oh, you got to make sure you've got the right minimums, or you got to know that this material has this many day lead time and this material has this many day lead time. So what does the calendar look like? You can imagine how complex that gets. And each product has like 5 or 6 different materials going into it, and they all have different lead times. So no human can comprehend all that information and make a decision-making calendar that allows them to achieve their delivery times. So that's where the role of AI comes in. Being able to consider, like I said earlier, high number of dimensions to make a single decision so you can make a better decision. The role of forecast, like I said, is still there, right? The forecast is what's driving your decision. But what they're allowing you to do is you're condensing your lead time for finished product. You're not condensing your overall lead time because that's physics based, right? Yeah, you need the material at this date, but you're condensing your lead time so that you can rely on, you could still make changes later in your decision-making process using a more updated forecast. So putting it all together, what's the benefit of machine learning-based forecast? It allows you to capture externalities and higher demand dimensions, right? However, without coupling it with an agile approach like what I just described, you're predicting 18 months out. But if you're working in the way that we're trying to work with brands, where you're predicting 3 months out, the effectiveness of that forecast is much greater. And you're able to actually action the forecasting outputs later on, meaning, less overproduction, better margins, less markdowns because you build the right product. And actually, one more thing that it does that is an indirect consequence is that it forces you to develop a relationship with your manufacturer that is less transactional.
At Hyran, are you actually handholding your client from the time they want to, roll out a product to production, or you're doing any kind of post service as well, just to understand what is like your handholding in the process look like?
So the handholding is two parts. So first, it's here's how you work today. Here's how much it's costing you. Here's how you should be working. Here's how it'll benefit you. Is your mind exploding right now by the number of decisions you're going to have to make? Don't worry. We have built a tool that will help you do that. So we do use AI. So one thing I didn't mention is that the role of AI is first figuring out what the decisions are, how much material you need to buy, how much color you need to commit to. Instead of forcing the human to have to make that decision, we use machine learning to be able to tell them, hey, this is the number and this is the justification behind the number. But we take some time to develop trust in that system so people start trusting it because they are accountable for that decision. The second thing is we understand that the brand's objective is to make sure that they have on-time delivery, which, might change in the future. But today, because, the brands we work with are typically selling to their wholesale selling, so they need to hit their delivery dates to their customers. Yeah. So as a result, what we allow them to do, what our model does is that ensures it acts in a more safe way. What does that mean? So when we're making a prediction of how much material is needed, we don't just say, oh, you need this on the 1st of March. This means this is how much material you need for 1st of March. What we say is that it's possible from our data, we know that this particular market, this particular SKU, this particular color typically over forecasts in the following month. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a risk here and we're going to buy material for not only the 1st of March, we're going to actually buy a little bit of material for the 15th of March as well, in case it spikes, because we have information that it typically does spike. So we'll use that to kind of dynamically adjust the flow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that kind of feeds into everything, right? Marketing and sales strategies. But like you said, also better relationships with the supplier. I just want to know, is it expensive for companies to pivot to this strategy as of today? And I also want to understand if that you think has any kind of price implications for the consumer.
So the shift for the companies is a cost saver. So on average, if they're doing pre-positioning of materials, they're paying 20 to 30% of their material buy in liabilities. If they're doing, so there's kind of three approaches that I would say, right? It's the old school approach, which is the PO based. So you don't have any material wastage there when you buy by PO because you're basically placing known orders.
Same order, yeah.
But you have finished goods waste. You have all this inventory that you didn't sell. Now that accounts to about $1 trillion a year in markdowns. And, brands lose a lot of the money on unsold inventory. I think you know that already, right? Version number 2 is brands are doing some form of pre-positioning. All big brands do this, by the way. They buy material in advance to cut lead time, and then they're placing orders later on. Now, the way they're doing those buys are not staggered, like the approach that I mentioned. They're just buying it in one go, and then they're placing POs later on to consume that material, and then they're hoping that the material and the POs match. They often don't, and often they vary by 30%, which means that, yes, they have less finished goods waste, but they have about 30% of their material buy in material waste, meaning if they're a big brand, they're paying somewhere like $20 million a year in material that they didn't use, which they typically burn in 30 days, but now they can't do that. So there's a huge material waste there. What we're doing, there's a couple of things. One, it allows them to basically eliminate their material waste down to, 5% of what it used to be honest, like much less, because you're not overbuying. There might still be waste, but that's the first thing. And we'll talk about how we can get rid of that waste as well. But the staggered approach allows them to reduce their material waste. The second thing is it allows them to capture additional revenue for readjusting the assortment categories. So for example, let's say they were producing a bunch of pink and that was maybe 80% of their buy and 20% of their buy was blue. Suddenly they do their first month of, the forecast gets updated. Before they would have no option to change it. There would be no way for them to adjust it. But now they have a forecast that says actually pink's not going to do as well as they thought. So instead of blue is doing better. Increase your blue assortment, ratio, and reduce your pink. Now you can do that. Now, what's that worth to them? Well, that's worth not only the additional revenue from the blue, but it's also worth the reduction of waste that they created in finished goods inventory of the pink. So that's worth a lot. Now, there are other benefits as well, but fundamentally, it means that the brand is saving money and generating more revenue. So I think at best, it'll have a neutral effect on the customers, meaning that they're not going to be impacted on cost. They will maybe get more products that they want. The final thing I will mention is that because of the ability to do this requires, let's say, a data digital highway. Basically, you need to have information coming from the factories and the brands. One thing that the benefit that customers will benefit from is reduction of out of stock. And what I mean by that is if we know from our system that a PO is something is out of stock online, meaning it's out of stock in the warehouse, but we can see that there's a PO that says that this product is coming in 3 weeks. Instead of saying it's out of stock online, we can just say, hey, it's coming in stock in 3 weeks. So if you really want this product, you can buy it now and get it in 3 weeks, because maybe there's specific leggings that, you feel fit your body really well, et cetera, et cetera. So that can be made. So all in all, I think the brand will see benefits. Now, whether those benefits will be passed down to the consumers, unlikely, because that's not how capitalism works, unfortunately. But that is the fundamental economics of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's super clear. I remember your conversation in Copenhagen earlier this year as well. And I remember you talking a little bit about Shein and talking about transferring value to consumers. Anytime there is a conversation around, representative from Shein, they typically say that we follow specifically this kind of demand forecasting model where we're able to predict how much to produce. That is why our prices are low. The alternative conversation is, of course, that you're not paying workers, their due. And that's why, an average product on your website costs I don't know, $7. So my question to you is around the sustainability aspect of this conversation. There is a lot of, superficial, self-serving kind of conversations around sustainability. There's a ton of greenwashing and they kind of go hand in hand. So what do you think are some of the examples that you feel is already, kind of misusing this kind of technology or misusing this conversation on sustainability?
Yeah. I think one thing I also said in Copenhagen was I don't like the word fast fashion. And a lot of people, there were a couple of reports afterwards calling me shameless. But let me explain, actually, because it was such a limited time, I didn't have a chance to explain, and it's relevant to what we're talking about. So the term fast fashion for me is misleading, and it's almost, I think, doing injustice to the challenges in the fashion industry, primarily because it ill defines, it shows a clear lack of understanding of the overall supply chain, which is how the products are consumed, which is where a lot of the emissions are generated. So in my opinion, there's two words. There's fast consumption. That's the psychological consumer behavior of buying something and having a repeated need to buy something, and that, has as much to do with the fashion companies as it has to do with the social media companies pushing you those advertisements, marketing agencies pushing you new adverts, social media influencers pushing you new product. There's a culture of consumerism, which is fundamentally what our economy is built on. Growth and more growth and perpetual growth. If you don't have a GDP of increasing 2% every year, you're basically in a recession, So that's the system that we live in, unfortunately. That's a different topic altogether. Then there's fast production. I advocate for fast production for a few reasons. One, it means that your supply chain is agile and you're as close as possible to on demand as you can possibly be, meaning you're producing less on guessing, like the 18 months. This is the problem with slow fashion. Now, I hope after we had a conversation, you can see the challenges of slow fashion, because the idea of slow fashion is to buy slow and, give workers time. It's wait a minute, that's fine, but slow fashion should be a consumer-based problem, not a factory-based problem. You should apply slow fashion to consumers, not to factories. Fast fashion in fast production is actually a really good thing. Fast production does not mean workers working harder, workers working longer, abuse of, workers in the factory. That's not what it means. Fast production means your systems are parallelized, meaning you're not working in a linear fashion, you're working in a parallel fashion. Things that can be done earlier on because they are not immediately needed, like buying material in advance, can be done earlier. And then you have a better plan of how many workers you need as well. Actually, in fact, it encourages better worker conditions. And I know this is going to sound, I know people who work in factories will agree with me, but I know people who work with factories might disagree with me. But what I'm trying to say here is planning for a factory is very challenging. Knowing how to resource the number of workers on a line is extremely difficult. Now, what I advocate for is not committing to finished products, but committing to materials and capacity. Give the factory security in saying, I'm going to do this many units with you. I just don't know how many, which ones I'm going to do. I think a factory would prefer that over, here is like an order this season. Maybe next season you get an order, maybe you don't. Maybe next month you get an order, maybe you don't. And the factory is constantly guessing how many units the brand's going to place, gives them this really weird, like uncertainty, tense situation where they're constantly wondering, okay, do we reduce our worker numbers? Do we increase our worker numbers?
Absolutely.
But having the ability for the brand to be like, hey, I'm going to commit to this many units a year because that's what I have a budget for. Now, I don't know whether or not those units are going to be this or that or this. If you're okay with that, we can develop partnership and have communication. And through, tools and technology, we can ensure that we give you the right information when you need it, how you need it, so you can make those decisions to keep this line running smoothly. What fast production also does is that it means quicker turnover of products. You're buying smaller, but you're buying more frequent. And it's possible that you buy even less because what you're doing there is you're basically able to, sense demand and react to it, which I hope would result in more full price sale, which should. But then also you're not required to, buy. I'll explain another thing slightly differently, but let's just leave it there. So you're going to have more full price sale. You're turning inventory more frequently, which means you're buying more frequently, which means your POs are staggered, which means you're paying your workers more frequently. You're paying your suppliers more frequently. Biggest challenge for suppliers, cash flow. It's also the biggest problem for brands. It helps both of you guys. You're buying more frequently, selling it, you get money in, you pay your dues, factory gets their dues, they're getting their money quicker. You're a finance person, you get the benefit of cash flow. Like the ability to reduce your cash flow strain is super important, and fast production supports that. And then fundamentally, I think it's actually one of those rare scenarios where actually fast production reduces your post-production waste, meaning you're going to have more alignment between your supply and demand, which means you're overproducing less and therefore, more effective. So that's my reason for like why fast production is actually one of those things to get you closer to sustainability. Now, the second thing that I don't do, it's not in my scope at the moment, but we're working on it, is what I call design for manufacturability. It's actually a word that a friend of mine, Brad Ballantyne, came up with, but I'm borrowing it. And I think it's a very effective word. And what that means is that a designer today has no idea about the future impacts of their design decisions. Let me give you a few examples. A designer can change the fabric. It literally means make a line item change. That change in fabric that took a second for the designer to do actually has an enormous impact on the factory. Fabric change means change in yarns, means 24 hours needed to set up the looms, means to reconfigure the machine, which takes a lot of time. There's a lot of knock-on effects, that happened. And one yarn change can mean an entire change in the fabric. So as a result, there needs to be an understanding of how does my decision today affect lead time, affect cost, affect minimums. The other thing I'm going to tell you is that the other issue about design for manufacturability is that designers are working in silos. Let's say your company has 100 designers for because you're Calvin Klein or something. Now, each of those 100 designers are working independently, thinking about what they want to show to the customer. Not thinking about, hey, wait a minute, if we all choose the same fabric or if we all choose similar fabric that is, shared amongst us, we can reduce our minimums.
Yep.
Like every material change requires a different minimum. What does that mean? You have to buy a minimum certain number of products, which means you're going to overproduce, which means you're going to generate waste. Same thing with color. Oh, I want that Pantone versus that Pantone. Well, guess what? There are minimums on dyes. You're going to need to dye, like those machines might have 50 kg, 100 kg limits on how much they need to dye. Well, if you're going to do a fabric that only has that much, like has a very specific blue that nobody else has, well, you better make sure that you need 50 kg of it because otherwise you're going to be hit with that minimum. But if you can convince the other designers, hey, let's all use these 20 different colors so we can hit our minimums and we can share minimums instead of each of us having our own minimum, we can reduce overproduction, we can reduce waste, all that stuff. So that kind of goes into the linear process of like designing more sustainably, manufacturing more sustainably. And obviously, the final thing that I think is really interesting is that if you can consolidate your materials, if you can choose similar fabrics, that actually simplifies the recycling process significantly. So you can develop SOPs for recycling. You can reuse that material. Now, do I pretend to have the answers for reverse logistics or making circular businesses or circular fashion make economic sense? No. I think there's a lot to figure out how you make circular fashion make economic sense. But yeah, I don't pretend to have the answers to that.
I just wanted to say on the humanitarian point of view, I remember when I was doing my internship in my undergrad at a factory which made denims for some of the biggest brands in the world. I was interning there for 2 months. I remember a whole bunch of migrant garment workers who would come to Delhi or Gurgaon to work for small projects were asked to leave because they were not making the specific design that they had expertise in anymore. So like you said, it's a line item or a small change in the design, but it impacts not in just production cycles, but on a humanitarian level. And in the summer months, then they would be out hunting in groups, 50, 60 garment workers would be going from factory to factory looking for work. So it's just interesting how you see like ripples of it specifically in the global south where a lot of the production happens. So thank you for sharing that. I think I want to talk a little bit more about what you want to achieve with Hyran. So like in 10 years, if you achieve your vision, where do you think Hyran technology is going to be?
Okay, so I think one of the challenges in the fashion industry is a mismatch between the power dynamics of suppliers and brands.
Yeah.
Suppliers have no power, brands have all the power. My hope is that with the technology that we're building, we are able to empower suppliers to be, if not on the same level, closer to brands, large brands, so that they can have a more common understanding, almost like a form of collective bargaining through technology. What do I mean by that? My hope and my vision is that I can convince the manufacturers that it's in their interest to work with me to digitize their supply chains. We'll ensure that they are protected in some sense, meaning if we're digitizing their capacity, I'm not going to let the brands know how much capacity they have available, because if they have very low utilization, the brands can use that in a commercial setting to take advantage of the factory, whatever. But if we can create a collective of suppliers that are digitally integrated, that can work in a certain way with us, meaning they give us their capacity availability, they tell us what fabrics they have on stock that are dead stock, materials that they, maybe brands ordered and they didn't pay for, or they have excess in, that we could create a couple of things: a marketplace for their capacity, meaning that where they do have available an appropriate capacity, they have a skill set that's needed. Manufacturers work with maybe like 10, 15, 20 brands at a time. And like you said, if that skill set is no longer needed for those 10, 15 brands, then suddenly, those workers aren't needed. So what happens when they work with us over a long period of time where we're all digitized? Well, what happens firstly is that we have available capacity, but appropriate capacity. What is this capacity capable of doing? Are they really good at jackets? Are they really good at, doing denim jeans or whatever? We have that available. We know what available fabric is there. Then what we can do is we can create, I don't like the word marketplace because it has too much of a commercial idea to it, but maybe in essence it is what it is. So the idea that big brands are able to work with manufacturers that have been validated through us and through, maybe we have a partner in the UN, like a Better Work, that's audited these factories. They can only be on our platform if they've been audited and they've passed the audit checks, so they don't have child labor, etc. So we have that digitization, and then it allows manufacturers to fill capacity with brands that they otherwise wouldn't have known. So it creates a demand for their capabilities. Maybe we provide them with intelligence on what kind of capabilities are needed so that they can train workers within a certain amount of time to those skill sets. Extra material, well, what is one person's waste could be another person's treasure, right? So the ability to see waste across multiple brands and say, hey, like today you burned that waste, but tomorrow you could actually sell that material maybe at a discount to another brand that needs it. And actually the final thing is, how do we truly change the relationship between brands and manufacturers is empower smaller brands. Today, smaller brands have no power. They can't go to a big factory and say, hey, give us this volume or give us this quantity. Yep. They can't even get access to those big factories. Now, if they have excess capacity and we're able to simplify, because the real reason why big manufacturers don't want to work with small brands is because the amount of servicing that it takes to support a brand in a facility is so high that a small brand that brings in like, I don't know, $50,000, $100,000 a year in material purchases and garment making costs is not worth it for you. So you basically don't work with them. But however, if there's technology, it's like us, and you can get 15, 20, 30 brands that are small that can fill a particular factory conditioned on certain things like, okay, you got to use this material, or, until you're like making $10 million and you want to buy your custom material, you got to work with this material, or if you can convince, that you can create constraints that are economically beneficial to the smaller brand, saying like, look, I know you want to use your specific R&D fabric, but that's not going to make economic sense for you to do that. So you can go ahead and try to find a factory that will make material with you, or you can work with us. And we have this really well R&D'd fabric that New Balance or Gymshark, whatever uses, and we can use that. And that means that you get better unit economics on your product. You're still able to tell your story, and you can still work in the business model that you have. And you can empower smaller creators to get access to cheaper pricing so they can support their business. And then maybe once they get bigger, they can have enough money to R&D fabric and make sure that that fabric is used. But that's the other thing. And the final point I wanted to make is that and 10 years from now, I want to be in a position to say, tomorrow, we're not going to have any non-sustainable materials on our platform. Like, you can only have that once you have that leverage, right? If we have that critical mass. So can we be the connection between brands and manufacturers, create so much value for both sides that we, at one point, 10 years from now, have the power to say, there's going to be no non-sustainable materials on our platform, and any brand that doesn't, any manufacturer that doesn't abide by the rules, or any brand that doesn't pay on time, will not get access to the network of factories, the intelligence associated with the planning way, the amount of money that you would save working through us, that you won't have access to that if you don't abide by these rules. And unfortunately, maybe that's me saying that I don't believe in the, let's say, the ability for governmental organizations or institutions to enforce law. I believe in them to create law, but perhaps we become a party to them to be able to enforce that law through technology and incentives. And that's just a wild vision that I have, but let's see if we ever get.
I love that. I think it's super collaborative in that way. I worked in India for so many years in the government industry where you know that certain regulations are in place, but implementation really is at the behest of the custodians of the supply chain or the value chain, let's just say, not just the supply chain. So I feel like you're right. I think the implementation of laws is probably, as far as I see it in my experience, the biggest bottleneck. Thanks for sharing that. I want to know, like, who has had an impact on you on a personal level as an entrepreneur or as somebody who just wants to create an impact within the fashion industry? Have you, like, any mentors or guides or friends who you look up to?
That's a good question. I mean, it's hard to pick one or two individuals. I just came back from Bangladesh a couple of days ago. Even speaking to the fabric planners there, hearing their stories, and that's actually had a big impact on the way I view problems. It's not been one individual person who has like a very senior role who's basically influenced my thinking. It's really getting to the grassroots level of how this industry works. You know, speaking to that material planner at the brand who does the job day to day, who understands the pain points, the struggles, which I get a lot of energy from. Speaking to that materials planner who's like 20 levels below the owner of the factory in terms of position of power, but has this insight, this unique insight of why things aren't working the way they expect them to, which for me are the most influential people in my day-to-day decision making from a product or from a vision perspective. Like, those people drive my vision. From a general perspective, I think inspiration of entrepreneurship, there are plenty in my family as well. Like, my grandfather is the one who started the factories in Pakistan. He's no longer alive, but he's been obviously an influence on me, to somebody, you know, who kind of just left his career as an electrical engineer to develop a sock factory. Like, what does he know about socks, you know? But that kind of risk taking, you know, it's all going to be okay vibe, and not everything has to be planned out to the nth degree. That definitely played a big role in my life. And then seeing people like a friend of mine who runs the business of fashion, Imran, he's being an influence, you know, just to see his sort of going from feeling like an outsider in the fashion industry. And he still talks about how he's an outsider in the fashion industry. Despite his position in the media world, in the fashion space, he still struggles to sometimes be accepted in the way that a lot of other people are accepted. And I wonder that if that has something to do with what we talked about before this call around gatekeeping. I think when I see that, I think one thing I mentioned to him recently was that actually, don't see that as a negative, see that as a positive, because you have that unique perspective because you're an outsider, because you're looking in as opposed to being within, where there's like, you know, power structures that perhaps want you to say certain things and not say other things. When you're outside looking in, you have true freedom. You have an objective view on what you're looking into, and you're able to comment on it in whatever way you feel fit, as opposed to worrying about how your actions might influence the outcome of a particular business deal or relationship that you're trying to foster. So I think at the end of the day, I think outsiders have an incredible value and I think responsibility in society to sort of reflect upon what's happening.
Yeah, I fully agree. And like I said, like, gatekeeping is kind of at all the levels. So you kind of feel that one of the reasons why I feel like a lot of the systems within the fashion industry are the way it is, are archaic, or the work culture is toxic in many, you know, big brands that we know today. It is because I think a lot of people who are in positions of power also feel that this is the rite of passage. So I think just to change that mold and mentality, I think is definitely has to come from somebody who is on the outside. So, all right. So I have one last question, and then we're going to do this fun rapid fire
Sure.
round. But I want to know, what do you do to chill? Like, when you're not working, what are you doing?
But I'm not working. So you know a little bit about my content creation stuff, right? So I make videos that, although that ends up bringing me more stress than my work,
Okay, man.
but I love history, as you can probably tell. But I love listening to history podcasts, understanding society, understanding why the way we are, we do what we do. And I'm a nerd, so that's like, if you offer me the opportunity to give you and discuss history with you, like, be careful because I could talk about it forever. So honestly, that's what gives me energy. Apart from that, I do make music. I play the guitar. I love going for long walks, like ridiculously long walks. Like I'll go for a 2 hour walk. So anyone who walks with me, they always get frustrated. They're like, I didn't bring shoes for this. I thought it was going to be down the road. I live in Cambridge, and people always ask me why I live in Cambridge, because like, you're in the action all the time. Why don't you live in London? I mean, I moved to Cambridge for university, and I worked here as well at the university, but I ended up staying because I think my mind is very chaotic. There's a lot going on in my mind in terms of random thoughts, like ADHD-esque thoughts. And I find that having that peaceful surrounding allows me to counterweight those thoughts. So I stay in a village basically because of that. So yeah, everything that you do in a village to chill, walk, breathe, clean air, that's basically what I do to chill.
That sounds very fun. Honestly, like I've just about discovered long walks, having moved to Europe like four or
Yeah,
5 years ago, because growing up in Delhi is not
it's not a thing
uh,
there, I'm sure.
it's not a thing. Yeah, you try to stay indoors as much as possible, especially now. Okay, so do you want to do a quick rapid fire?
Yeah, let's
Well,
do
I
it.
mean, as rapid as you like.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna shoot some questions to you. First one is definitely the antithesis of everything we've discussed today. The first is, do you have a favorite fashion trend? I mean, it doesn't have to be at the moment, but you know, over the time of existence listed previously.
Right. So I quite like, this could be controversial, but I quite like the Mughal era clothing, the kind of ornamental, clothing, which was very, the wide shalwar kameez, the sherwanis. I think that's still popular probably in Pakistan and India, but I always thought about like, there could be some, fusion between that.
I see it.
Do you know who Dilip Singh is?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's like a picture of Dilip Singh in Queen Victoria's palace, and
Yeah.
that kind of clothing I think is pretty interesting.
I know the picture you're talking about, actually. I think I've seen it online, but I'm obsessed with like Mughal jewels. Like, if I could, I would be marrying a mantika on this podcast. Like, cool. I love that. And what is the one era that you would like to live through? And I know that you cover a lot of them on your podcast, so I went through some of your videos, but what is one of them that you would want to have lived through?
I think there's probably two eras that I thought would be quite interesting. Like either I would have liked to live in the Victorian era in the UK, just because, it seemed like an era of like, I know there's a lot of problems in that era as well, but an era of like an inflection point. A lot was changing during that time. And I think it would have been fascinating to see all those things that are changing. Or alternatively, I would have liked to have been in post-World War II, where there was like, again, an era of rebuilding and again, shift in. I guess I like being around when I think there's an inflection point in society, because you can see what's happening. It kind of feels like we're in that life right now, right?
I
Like
think so.
there's an
Yeah.
inflection point.
On multiple levels, I feel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what is one emotion that you feel describes your career journey? I know it's a bit like, I know it's not easy to answer that.
Emotion. I think that it depends on, I'm looking into my own career journey, then I'll have a different maybe adjective or emotion versus someone looking into my journey, you know what I mean? So for me personally, it feels anxiety, right? So it's like, why did I choose a path that my mother always tells me, why didn't you just become a software engineer at Microsoft?
I know,
Your
right?
life would be so much easier. What is this weird route? You're a PhD, you're an academic, and now you want to start your own company. You're starting, like, it's like,
Yeah.
why did I make it so hard for myself? And I think there's a sense of anxiety, I guess, but I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't say that it's anxiety that I want to get rid of. It's also a sense of two feelings. So definitely anxiety, like day to day, I definitely feel a lot of maybe anxiety, and maybe I should talk to somebody about that. But the other thing is I feel a sense of opportunity, because I feel like when the path is not paved, it could be anything. The path could be anything. If I was a doctor, my dad, I would know, like, the path is this, so yeah.
And is there a word in Urdu which defines your work, you feel like, or which you feel connected to?
So I know that my company is called Hyran, but actually the word was Hyran, which is deer in Urdu.
Okay. I thought, I did think it because I saw your logo, but okay.
So yeah, so I mean, a deer, and deer is like fast and agile and, chameleon-esque. That's kind of the idea of the work that we're trying to do from a purpose perspective. But I think there's another word, which I don't know if you're familiar with, called jugaad.
Yeah, I love Jugaad.
Yeah, that's basically my life and my work, which is just like, going with the flow, hacking things together. So yeah, that's basically it, yeah.
It's like A1 philosophy coming out of South Asia. Guys who don't know, I'm going to put a blurb at the bottom of to explain it as best as I can. And what are you listening to or reading during your work travels? Like,
I really like long form.
yeah.
I don't like anything less than 40 minutes. I'm like, this is not going to be good because it's not deep enough. I love The Rest is History, this podcast, or Empire by William Dalrymple and Nita Anand. Yeah, it's a great podcast. I guess a lot of those are history podcasts. I listen to basically two things. I'm like a Pakistani or like an Indian uncle who just listens to two things, either history or politics. Those are my two. Only thing I'm not doing to fulfill that persona is to transfer conspiracy theories, but I am kind of making videos on conspiracy theories, right? So I fulfill the trifecta of being a brown uncle, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think I deviate too much from that. So yeah, reading a lot of history books or listening to a lot of history podcasts is basically what I do.
Yeah. And is there a fashion brand you think like is aspirational to you in terms of either you want to see them as a client or you love their work in terms of brand and the way they've built themselves up?
Patagonia for sure. I think they're one of the few brands that feel like they do things for the long term as opposed to quarterly earnings. Gani, I think as well. They
Yeah.
do take a lot of a risk for a brand that isn't huge, that's doing pretty interesting things. To be honest, even one of our clients, New Balance. And I say that not from a brand perspective. I say that more from a people perspective because I've got to know them for over the last few months. We haven't been working for them that long, but just a sense of can do. Like, I was very surprised because we've tried to work with other large brands in the past, and just this shift from buying once a month to once a year to buying, in a staggered approach. Despite how many numbers, what stories I tell, how I make the business case, it's not always landed. By the way, this is prior to us having a brand doing it. Before any brand agreed to do it, it was very difficult to get any brand to do it. And the first brand that agreed to do it with us was New Balance. And I think that obviously resulted in a chain effect. Other brands are now saying, oh, New Balance is doing it. Cool, we should do it too.
Yeah.
But I think the mindset of the people there, at least the people that I've met, it's a much larger organization. Like I want them to succeed because of that. Like they just seem like they're willing to challenge their ways. And that's honestly a rarity.
I think that's the end of it, Ahmed. I think we've discussed a lot of things today. I think I learned a lot. I think I have more questions than I did before the beginning of this podcast. So that's probably going to be like another conversation. But thank you so much for bringing all that. And I think this is going to be really interesting, not only for people like myself who understand how these systems work, but also somebody who has no idea. And I think that is the aim of the conversation, just to be able to serve something which is easy to understand from some of the best people, like who do it well. So I appreciate you bringing all that to the conversation today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right.